The text arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the kind of hour when your phone lighting up means emergency or mistake. I was half asleep, one arm draped over Rebecca, my fiancée of 8 months, when the screen cast shadows across our bedroom ceiling. The message was from Sophie, Rebecca's best friend since college, the woman who'd helped me pick the engagement ring, who cried at our proposal dinner, who was supposed to stand beside Rebecca on our wedding day. 3 words that made my chest tighten before my brain fully understood them. Call me. It's urgent. I stared at those letters like they were written in a language I almost recognized but couldn't quite translate. Sophie never texted this late. Sophie never used the word urgent unless someone was in the hospital. I slid out of bed, grabbed my robe, and stepped into the hallway where the hardwood was cold enough to wake me completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Webb, 34 years old, senior project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, the kind of guy who double-checks measurements and keeps backup plans in his glove compartment. I'm not the jealous type, never have been. Trust was something I gave freely because I believed adults earned it and kept it. Rebecca taught 3rd grade, came home smelling like chalk and hand sanitizer, talked about her kids like they were tiny philosophers. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue 3 years ago, bonded over a shared hatred of cilantro and a love of old westerns. The proposal happened at the same park where we had our first real conversation, under the oak tree she'd mentioned wanting to see in every season. She said yes before I finished the question. 8 months later, we were 12 weeks from a wedding that had consumed our lives in the best possible way. Invitations sent, venue locked, her dress hanging in a spare closet like a ghost of the future. Everything felt aligned, the kind of alignment you stop questioning because questioning it feels like inviting bad luck. I stood in the hallway and called Sophie. She picked up on the first ring, her voice low and strained like she'd been crying or preparing to. Marcus, I'm so sorry to do this to you, she said, and I felt my stomach drop in that specific way it does when you know something foundational is about to crack. I told her to slow down, to breathe, to tell me what happened. She took a shaky inhale and said the sentence that split my timeline into before and after. Rebecca's been seeing someone else. I found out tonight and I just can't keep this from you. The air in the hallway felt too thin. I leaned against the wall, the texture of the paint rough under my palm, grounding me when nothing else would. I asked her if she was certain, if there was any chance of a misunderstanding, grasping for the exit ramp that wasn't there. Sophie's voice cracked. She'd seen them together earlier that evening at a wine bar across town, the kind of place Rebecca said she never went to because it was too pretentious. They weren't just talking. They were tangled in each other, his hand on her thigh, her laugh the one she used when she felt safe and seen. Sophie had stayed hidden, took photos, then sat in her car for an hour trying to decide if telling me was betrayal or mercy. I asked her to send me what she had. My voice came out steady, calmer than I felt, the same tone I used on job sites when a wall wasn't plumb and panic wouldn't fix it. Sophie hesitated, then said she'd send everything, but she needed me to know she wasn't trying to destroy anything, she just couldn't watch me walk into a marriage built on a lie. I thanked her, hung up, and watched the screen as 3 photos loaded in succession. Rebecca in a corner booth, leaning into a man I'd never seen, dark hair, tailored jacket, the kind of confidence that comes from getting away with things. His hand rested on her lower back in a way that spoke of familiarity, of evenings that weren't the first. Her smile was the one I thought belonged to me, wide and unguarded, the kind she flashed when I surprised her with her favorite takeout or remembered the small things. The timestamp read 9:23 p.m., exactly when she'd texted me saying she was grading papers at home and going to bed early. I stood there in my hallway, barefoot and cold, staring at evidence that rewrote months of my life in seconds. I didn't go back to the bedroom right away. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and set it on the counter like an anchor. My hands wanted to shake, but I wouldn't let them. Men my age, men raised by fathers who fixed engines and settled disputes with handshakes, learn early that reaction is a luxury you can't afford when the stakes are high. I thought about every late night she'd claimed exhaustion, every girl's night that ran long, Every time she'd been distant and I'd chalked it up to wedding stress or work. The pieces didn't just fit, they slammed together with the precision of a door closing. I opened a new note on my phone and began typing. Date, time, location from Sophie's text, description of the man, the way Rebecca's posture curved toward him like a plant toward light. This wasn't journaling. It was documentation. I added Sophie's contact info, noted that she was a credible witness with no reason to fabricate, someone who loved Rebecca and had everything to lose by coming forward. Then I saved the photos in 3 places, tagged them with metadata, and created a folder I labeled Financial Review, boring enough that no one would look twice. The bedroom door was still cracked when I returned. Rebecca lay exactly as I'd left her, one hand tucked under the pillow, breathing slow and even, the picture of peace. I stood in the doorway and studied her like a stranger, trying to reconcile the woman I'd planned a future with and the woman in Sophie's photos. They were the same person, and that was the part that hollowed me out. I slid back into bed, kept my distance, and stared at the ceiling until the shapes stopped making sense and the numbers on the clock became a countdown I couldn't stop. Morning came with the mechanical kindness of routine. Rebecca's alarm went off at 6:30, she stretched, kissed my shoulder, and asked if I'd slept well. I said fine, matching her tone, and watched her move through the room like a woman with nothing to hide. She hummed while she picked out her outfit, asked if I wanted eggs or oatmeal, mentioned that Sophie had texted about bridesmaid dress fittings next week. I made oatmeal, added the brown sugar she liked, and handed her the bowl with a smile that felt like wearing a mask made of glass. Over breakfast, she scrolled through wedding Pinterest boards, debating napkin colors and centerpiece height like these details mattered more than vows. I nodded in the right places, offered opinions that sounded engaged, and filed every word against the timeline I was building in my head. She mentioned needing to run errands after school, maybe grabbing dinner with a coworker to discuss classroom supplies. I asked which coworker, casual as ordering coffee, and she said Amanda without hesitation, the name smooth and practiced. I added it to my notes the second she left for work, then sat at the kitchen table and made a plan the way I'd approach any complex project. Step 1, verify the scope. Step 2, gather resources. Step 3, execute with precision. I wasn't going to confront her in a parking lot or throw accusations over dinner. I was going to dismantle the lie piece by piece until the truth had nowhere left to hide, and she had no story left to sell. I called Sophie mid-morning from my office, door closed, blinds angled just enough to discourage interruptions. She answered quietly, like she'd been waiting. I thanked her for the night before, told her it took courage to do what she did, and asked if she'd be willing to help me understand the full picture. Sophie exhaled relief. She'd been terrified I'd hate her, that I'd accuse her of jealousy or meddling, that their friendship would implode and I'd choose denial over truth. I assured her that wasn't the case, that what she'd given me was a gift even if it didn't feel like one, and that I needed her eyes and ears in places I couldn't reach. She agreed without hesitation. Rebecca confided in her, always had, and Sophie suspected there were conversations she'd been part of that held more context than I had access to. We made a plan to meet for coffee that afternoon, somewhere Rebecca wouldn't think to look, somewhere we could trade information like the allies we'd unexpectedly become. The coffee shop was a small place near the university, filled with students bent over laptops and the kind of ambient noise that makes private conversations invisible. Sophie arrived first, already seated in the back corner with 2 cups in front of her, one black, one with cream, remembering how I took mine even in crisis. She looked exhausted, eyes red-rimmed, guilt sitting heavy on her shoulders. I sat across from her and said the thing she needed to hear. "You didn't cause this. You just stopped me from marrying into it." Her face crumpled briefly, then reset. She pulled out her phone and walked me through what she knew. The man's name was Derek Callahan, a financial analyst she'd seen Rebecca with twice before but assumed was a work connection, someone tied to school fundraising or budget committees. Last night shattered that assumption. She'd gone to the wine bar to meet a Tinder date who'd stood her up, and spotted them in a booth that might as well have been a bedroom for how little they cared about discretion. She watched for 20 minutes, took the photos, then left before her presence could blow back. Sophie scrolled to older texts between her and Rebecca, moments where Rebecca had mentioned being tired or stressed or needing space, language that now read like cover. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She showed me a message from 2 months ago where Rebecca joked about a guy at a charity gala who wouldn't stop flirting, said he was charming but not her type. Sophie had laughed it off. Now it looked like reconnaissance, Rebecca testing how much she could say without raising flags. I asked Sophie if Rebecca had ever mentioned problems between us, complaints or doubts that might explain the why. She shook her head. If anything, Rebecca gushed, talked about how stable I was, how ready she felt, how lucky she was to have found someone who didn't play games. The irony sat between us like a third person at the table. I finished my coffee and asked Sophie the question that mattered most. Would she be willing to stay close to Rebecca, keep acting like nothing had changed, and report back anything that might help me understand the scope of what I was dealing with? Sophie's jaw set. She nodded once, firm and clear. I'm with you, she said. Whatever you need. That night, Rebecca came home late, apologetic, claiming Amanda had needed to vent about a difficult parent and lost track of time. I asked how Amanda was doing, where they'd eaten, small questions designed to build a map. She answered easily, details stacking into a story that sounded true if you didn't know it wasn't. We ate leftover pasta, watched half a sitcom, and went to bed at different times, her claiming she needed to prep lesson plans, me pretending I had emails to clear. Alone in the office, I opened my laptop and began the next phase. I pulled up our shared cell phone account, the one we'd merged 6 months ago for the discount, and scanned the call logs. Numbers I didn't recognize repeated in patterns, late nights, mid-afternoons, 10-minute calls that didn't match her stated schedule. I copied them into a spreadsheet, cross-referenced with her texts to me during those windows, and found gaps large enough to drive a truck through. One number appeared 17 times in the past month, always when she was supposedly alone or with friends. I ran it through a reverse lookup. Derek Callahan. Financial analyst. Office downtown. LinkedIn profile showing a man who looked exactly like the one in Sophie's photos, smiling like someone who'd never been caught. I didn't feel rage. I felt the cold clarity that comes when a blueprint finally makes sense, when the measurements you've been double-checking reveal the flaw you suspected but couldn't prove. I saved the call log, downloaded a month's worth of location data from the phone tracker we'd activated during a camping trip when service was spotty, and watched the dots on the map tell a story Rebecca's mouth never would. Evenings at his apartment building. Afternoons at hotels I recognized from business conferences. A weekend she'd said was a teacher's retreat that pinged from a bed and breakfast 2 hours north, the same coordinates as Derek's weekend getaway based on a geotagged photo he'd posted and then deleted. I took screenshots of everything, organized them by date, and backed them up to an encrypted cloud drive I'd created that afternoon, password protected with a string of characters only I would know. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about making sure the truth couldn't be rewritten when emotions ran high and memories became negotiable. The next morning, I did what calm men do when a project grows beyond their expertise. I called a lawyer. Not a bulldog litigator who'd escalate everything into a war, but a sharp family attorney a colleague had used during his divorce, someone known for protecting assets and keeping drama contained. Her name was Victoria Brennan, 50-something, with a voice that sounded like she'd seen every version of this story and still believed in fairness. I explained the situation without editorializing, gave her the basics: engaged not yet married, joint savings account, her name on the lease, wedding deposits split between us, evidence of infidelity but no confrontation yet. She listened without interrupting, then asked the question that mattered. What do you want the outcome to be? I told her I wanted to end this cleanly, protect what I'd contributed financially, and make sure she couldn't rewrite the narrative into something where I was the villain. Victoria said that was achievable, but timing mattered. The closer we got to the wedding, the messier the unraveling would be, emotionally and legally. She advised building an airtight case, documenting everything, and choosing the moment of revelation strategically, ideally with witnesses who could verify my behavior stayed calm and my evidence stayed factual. I asked her about the wedding itself, whether canceling now or later made a difference. She said it depended on what I wanted the story to be. Canceling quietly would save face but let Rebecca control the narrative to mutual friends and family. Canceling publicly, with evidence, would burn bridges but ensure everyone knew why. Then she offered a third option, one I hadn't considered. If you want to make a statement, you could let the wedding proceed to a point, then present your case when it matters most. It's bold, but if your goal is to ensure she can't lie her way out, there's no better stage than the one she's built. The idea landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading in every direction. I thanked her, scheduled a follow-up, and hung up feeling like I'd just been handed a tool I wasn't sure I had the stomach to use. But the more I sat with it, the more it made a brutal kind of sense. Rebecca had constructed an elaborate performance, 2 lives running on parallel tracks, one for me and one for Derek. If I wanted to dismantle the illusion, I needed to do it where the audience was already gathered, where the lights were brightest and the exits were few. That weekend, Rebecca wanted to visit the venue for a final walkthrough, check the setup, confirm table arrangements, all the details that brides obsess over when the day feels close enough to touch. I agreed, played the supportive fiancée, held her hand as we toured the garden where the ceremony would happen, the ballroom where we'd dance, the terrace where guests would toast our future. The coordinator gushed about how in love we looked, how perfectly everything was coming together, and Rebecca beamed, squeezing my hand like this was the happiest moment of her life. I smiled back, nodded at the floral mock-ups, approved the lighting scheme, and felt like an actor in a play where only I knew the script had changed. On the drive home, Rebecca rested her head on my shoulder and said she couldn't wait to marry me, that she'd never been more certain of anything. I kissed her temple and said I felt the same, and the lie tasted like metal. That night, I met Sophie again, this time at her apartment where Rebecca would never think to look. She'd been gathering intel, careful and deliberate, asking questions that sounded like wedding planning but mapped onto my timeline perfectly. Rebecca had mentioned needing to finalize a few things this week, appointments she'd been vague about, and Sophie had gently pressed until Rebecca admitted she was meeting with a planner, someone helping coordinate logistics. Derek didn't know it yet, but he was going to be part of the ceremony, she'd joked, not in the way Marcus thinks. Sophie's face had gone pale when she realized what that meant, that Rebecca wasn't just having an affair, she was integrating it into the fabric of our wedding, threading her betrayal into the event that was supposed to symbolize our commitment. I asked Sophie what she thought Rebecca's endgame was, whether she planned to leave me after the wedding or keep both lives running indefinitely. Sophie shook her head. I think she wants the stability you provide and the excitement he provides. I don't think she's planning to choose. I think she's planning to have both. The anger I'd been holding at arm's length finally broke the surface, not as rage but as something colder and more focused, the kind of fury that doesn't shout but builds. I told Sophie about Victoria's suggestion, the idea of letting the wedding proceed and revealing the truth when it would have maximum impact. Sophie's eyes went wide, then thoughtful. You'd really do that? In front of everyone? I said I didn't know yet, that it depended on whether I could stomach it, whether the statement was worth the spectacle. She leaned back, processing, then said something that shifted my resolve. If you do it, I'll stand with you. Literally. You said you wanted me to keep pretending to be her friend, to stay close. What if I stay close all the way to the altar? What if you make me the maid of honor? The idea was audacious, the kind of plan that sounded insane until you realized it was perfect. Rebecca's best friend, the woman who knew the truth, standing beside her while she lied to a room full of people who loved her. It was poetic. It was ruthless. It was exactly the kind of quiet demolition that would make the point without me having to raise my voice. I asked Sophie if she was serious, if she understood what that would mean, the fallout, the inevitable accusation that she'd betrayed their friendship. She didn't hesitate. She betrayed you. And she put me in a position where staying silent made me complicit. I'm done protecting her from consequences she chose. We shook hands like business partners closing a deal, and I felt the architecture of the plan click into place. Rebecca would get her wedding, the dress, the flowers, the guests, everything she'd orchestrated. And at the moment she expected to hear vows, she'd hear the truth instead, delivered calmly, backed by evidence, with her best friend standing as witness to the fact that some betrayals don't deserve the shelter of privacy. It was the kind of long game men my age understand, the patience to let someone dig their own hole while you build the walls that keep them in it. The following week, I told Rebecca I'd been thinking about the wedding party, how Sophie had been so instrumental in helping us get to this point, and how it didn't feel right that she wasn't standing up there with us. Rebecca lit up, said she'd thought about it too but didn't want to seem like she was playing favorites among her friends. I said it wasn't favoritism, it was recognition, and suggested we make Sophie the maid of honor, a gesture that honored how much she meant to both of us. Rebecca teared up, called Sophie immediately, and asked her on speakerphone if she'd take the role. Sophie's voice was perfect, surprised, honored, emotional in all the right ways. She said yes, and Rebecca hugged me like I'd just given her the greatest gift. I hugged her back and thought about the gift I was actually giving, the truth she'd spent months trying to bury, delivered in the place she least expected it. Sophie and I met twice more over the next 2 weeks, refining the plan, making sure every detail was accounted for. I would wait until the ceremony itself, the moment after the officiant asked if anyone had objections. Traditionally, that's when the room holds its breath, when the question is rhetorical and the silence is brief. This time, the silence would break. I would step forward, not with rage but with clarity, and present the evidence I had been building, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. Photos, call logs, location data, all of it displayed on a screen I'd arrange with the AV team under the guise of a surprise slideshow. The room would see what I'd seen, and Rebecca would have to answer not just to me but to every person who'd come to celebrate a union that didn't exist. Sophie would stand beside her, a visual reminder that betrayal has witnesses, that the people you trust most are sometimes the ones who refuse to let you get away with it. I continued playing the role of excited groom, attending tastings, confirming RSVPs, writing checks for deposits that I knew I'd never see returned. Rebecca noticed nothing, or if she did, she dismissed it as pre-wedding jitters. She grew more affectionate, more present, like the idea of the finish line made her want to cross it convincingly. We had sex more often, she initiated date nights, she talked about honeymoon plans and the house we'd buy and the kids we'd name. Every word was a nail in the coffin she didn't know she was building, and I let her hammer them in one by one. The week before the wedding, Derek called her while we were having dinner. She stepped outside to take it, claimed it was a vendor with a last-minute question, and returned 10 minutes later with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I asked if everything was okay. She said it was perfect, kissed me, and suggested we open the wine we'd been saving. We toasted to the future, and I thought about how the future she imagined and the one I was constructing were about to collide in a way she'd never recover from. The night before the wedding, Rebecca stayed at her parents' house, tradition dictating we shouldn't see each other until the ceremony. I was grateful for the distance, for the space to finalize the logistics without her sensing the shift. I met with the AV technician I'd hired separately, a guy who thought he was setting up a surprise tribute video, and walked him through the exact moment I'd need the screen live, the exact files I'd need displayed. He thought it was romantic, a groom showing his bride how much he cherished their journey. I didn't correct him. I also met with Victoria one last time, confirmed that my assets were protected, that the evidence was documented in a way that would hold up if Rebecca tried to claim I'd fabricated anything, and that I had a witness willing to testify to both the affair and my measured response. She asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with it, if I'd considered the emotional cost of such a public revelation. I told her I'd considered it, that the alternative was living a lie or letting her rewrite the story into something where I was the one who couldn't forgive, who threw away a good thing over a misunderstanding. This way, the record would be clear. She nodded, wished me luck, and said she'd be available by phone if things escalated beyond my control. I spent the night alone in our apartment, the place that would soon be just mine again, and walked through the rooms like a man saying goodbye to a version of himself. The Marcus who'd proposed under that oak tree, who'd believed love was simple if you were honest, who'd thought building a life with someone was about shared values and mutual respect, that version was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone who understood that trust wasn't a gift you gave freely but a contract you enforced when it was broken. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey I didn't finish and watched the hours tick toward a day that would redefine everything. At dawn, I showered, shaved, put on the tuxedo Rebecca had helped me choose, and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't angry. He was ready. The venue looked like something out of a fairy tale when I arrived, flowers everywhere, white chairs in perfect rows, a string quartet tuning under the garden arbor. Guests were beginning to trickle in, dressed in their best, carrying gifts, hugging each other with the kind of joy that comes from believing they're about to witness something beautiful. I greeted them calmly, shook hands, accepted congratulations, played the part so well that no one suspected the ground beneath them was about to crack. Sophie arrived early, dressed in the deep blue bridesmaid gown Rebecca had chosen, her face composed but her eyes meeting mine with an understanding that needed no words. She squeezed my hand briefly, a soldier acknowledging a fellow soldier before battle, and took her place near the bridal suite where Rebecca was getting ready. I stood at the front, hands clasped, breathing steadily, and waited for the music to start. Rebecca appeared at the far end of the aisle, her father's arm linked with hers, the dress flowing like water, her smile radiant and certain. She looked like every bride in every wedding photo, beautiful and hopeful and completely unaware that the story she thought she was stepping into had already been rewritten. The guests stood, the music swelled, and she walked toward me with the confidence of someone who believed the performance was flawless. I watched her approach, saw Sophie fall into step behind her, and felt the final piece lock into place. When Rebecca reached me, she handed her bouquet to Sophie, took my hands, and looked into my eyes like we were the only two people in the world. The officiant began the ceremony, voice warm and practiced, talking about love and commitment and the journey we were about to begin together. I listened, nodded, waited for the moment I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in my head. And when the officiant asked if anyone present had reason to object to this union, I didn't let the silence settle. I stepped back, looked at Rebecca, and said the words that would end everything. I do. The room inhaled collectively, a sound like wind being sucked backward through a tunnel. Rebecca's face drained of color, her hands still clasped in mine but suddenly rigid, like she'd been turned to stone mid-gesture. The officiant blinked, smiled uncertainly, assuming this was some kind of romantic joke, a groom's nervous humor breaking through at the wrong moment. But I didn't smile back. I released Rebecca's hands gently, turned to face the guests, and spoke in the same steady voice I used to present quarterly reports to skeptical clients. I need everyone to stay seated for just a few minutes. There's something you all need to see before this goes any further. My father stood halfway, protective instinct kicking in, but my mother touched his arm and he settled back down, confusion written across both their faces. Rebecca found her voice, shaky and small. "Marcus, what are you doing?" I looked at her, not with anger but with something closer to pity, the way you'd look at someone who'd just realized they'd miscalculated badly. "I'm making sure everyone here knows the truth before they witness a vow that doesn't mean what you're pretending it does." I signaled to the AV technician, and the large screen we'd positioned for the reception slideshow flickered to life behind us, visible to every guest in their white chairs. Rebecca's bouquet slipped from Sophie's hands, hitting the ground with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than it should have. The first image appeared, time-stamped and clear, Rebecca and Derek at the wine bar, his hand on her thigh, her head tilted toward him in a posture that didn't require translation. A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain, people leaning forward to see better, to understand what they were looking at and why it was interrupting a wedding ceremony. Rebecca spun toward the screen, then back to me, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her brain trying to catch up to a situation spiraling beyond her control. The second photo loaded, the two of them outside a hotel, his arm around her waist, her laughing into her phone, the kind of image that makes context irrelevant because the body language says everything. Someone in the third row gasped. Rebecca's mother stood, one hand pressed to her chest, her face a mask of dawning horror. I stepped closer to the microphone the officiant had been using, my voice carrying across the garden with the same calm I'd maintained for weeks. 3 months ago, I started noticing inconsistencies. Late nights that didn't add up. Texts that disappeared. A feeling I couldn't shake that the woman I was planning to marry was living a life I wasn't part of. I paused, let that settle, watched Rebecca's father's face harden from confusion into something sharper. I didn't want to believe it. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I gathered evidence. The screen shifted to a call log, numbers highlighted, Derek's name appearing again and again in the metadata I'd pulled from our shared phone account. 17 calls in 1 month, each one happening when Rebecca had told me she was somewhere else, doing something else, with someone else. I heard my mother's breath catch, a small wounded sound that made my chest tighten, but I kept going because stopping now would mean all of this had been for nothing. Her best friend, Sophie, saw them together 2 weeks ago and had the courage to tell me what was happening. Not because she wanted to hurt Rebecca, but because she couldn't stand by and watch me walk into a marriage built on lies. I gestured toward Sophie, who stood frozen beside Rebecca, tears streaming down her face but her spine straight, her presence a statement louder than words. Rebecca turned on her, venomous, her voice cracking. "You told him? You're supposed to be my friend." Sophie's response was quiet but clear enough for the front rows to hear. "Friends don't let friends destroy good people." The screen cycled to location data, a map with pins marking every time Rebecca's phone had been at Derek's apartment, at hotels, at the bed and breakfast she'd claimed was a teacher's retreat. I pointed to the dates, matched them against the calendar of lies she'd fed me, and watched her credibility crumble in real time. Her bridesmaids sat motionless, one of them crying softly, another staring at Rebecca like she'd never seen her before. I pulled out my phone, connected it to the speaker system with a cable I'd tested twice that morning, and played the audio I'd recorded 3 nights before Rebecca on the phone with Derek, her voice light and conspiratorial. "He has no idea. Honestly, I think he's so focused on the wedding details he wouldn't notice if I disappeared for a week." Derek's laugh came through, low and smug. "Good. Means we have time. After you're married and things settle, we can figure out how to make this permanent." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and undeniable. Rebecca's knees buckled slightly, and she reached for the arbor to steady herself, her face no longer pale but flushed with a humiliation so acute it looked painful. Her father stood fully now, his voice booming across the garden. "Is this true, Rebecca? Tell me right now, is any of this true?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at me with something between desperation and fury, and said the only thing left that might save her. "You recorded me without my permission. You invaded my privacy. This is illegal." Victoria had prepared me for this exact deflection, coached me on how to respond without getting defensive, how to let the facts carry the weight. "I recorded a phone conversation you had in our shared apartment, on a device we both pay for, about an affair you were hiding from me and everyone here. If that's the hill you want to die on, we can discuss legality with my attorney after this is over." I looked past her to the officiant, who seemed to have aged a decade in the span of 5 minutes. "I'm sorry you were brought into this under false pretenses." I tried to find a way to handle it privately, but she left me no choice. She wasn't going to stop. She was going to go through with this, take my name, access my finances, and keep seeing him on the side. I couldn't let that happen. The officiant nodded slowly, removed his stole, and stepped back, a silent signal that there would be no ceremony, no vows exchanged, no union blessed. Rebecca finally found her full voice, shrill and defensive, aimed at the crowd like a lawyer making a closing argument. "This is humiliation. You're doing this to punish me in front of everyone I love." I shook my head, kept my tone even. "I'm doing this so everyone you love knows why I'm walking away. So they don't spend the next year hearing your version, where I'm the villain who couldn't forgive a mistake." Sophie stepped forward then, her voice stronger now, addressing the guests directly. "I've known Rebecca for 12 years. I helped her pick out that dress. I was supposed to stand beside her today and celebrate. But 2 weeks ago, I saw her with another man, and I couldn't keep quiet. Not when Marcus deserved to know. Not when all of you deserved to know what you were really here to witness." She turned to Rebecca, her face a mix of grief and resolve. "I loved you like a sister. But you made choices that hurt people who trusted you, and I won't be complicit in that. Not even for you. The garden was so quiet I could hear the rustle of programs in people's hands, the distant hum of traffic beyond the hedges, the shutter click of someone's phone capturing a moment that would live in infamy on social media within the hour. Rebecca's mother finally spoke, her voice thick with tears. "Rebecca, honey, please tell me this isn't what it looks like." Rebecca turned to her mother, and for a brief second, I thought she might confess, might take accountability and try to salvage something from the wreckage. Instead, she pointed at me, her hand shaking. "He's obsessed. He's been controlling and paranoid for months. This is what happens when you try to leave someone like that." The lie was so brazen, so disconnected from the evidence still displayed on the screen behind us, that several guests audibly scoffed. My father stood again, and this time my mother didn't stop him. He walked to the front, stood beside me, and faced Rebecca with the kind of disappointed authority that doesn't need volume. "I've known Marcus his entire life. Controlling isn't a word anyone who knows him would use. Thorough, yes. Honest, absolutely. But you're standing in front of 100 people with proof of your affair on a screen, and you're still lying." He looked at Rebecca's father, a man he'd shared beers with at engagement parties and holiday dinners. "I'm sorry your daughter put you in this position. But my son did the right thing, and I'm proud of him for it." Rebecca's father didn't respond. He just stared at his daughter, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come, and when the silence stretched too long, he turned and walked back to his seat, his wife following, both of them moving like people leaving a funeral. I looked at Rebecca one last time, and despite everything, I felt something close to sadness for her. Not regret, but the specific sorrow that comes from watching someone destroy themselves with choices they didn't have to make. "I'm not doing this to ruin you," I said quietly, just loud enough for her in the front rows to hear. "I'm doing this to free myself from a future where I'm the fool who didn't see it coming. You made your decisions. I'm just making sure everyone understands why I made mine." I took off the boutonniere she'd pinned to my lapel that morning, set it on the arbor beside her abandoned bouquet, and turned to leave. Sophie fell into step beside me, and together we walked down the aisle, past rows of stunned faces, past friends who didn't know whether to clap or cry, past family members already pulling out phones to text the people who hadn't been invited. Behind us, I heard Rebecca's voice, desperate and cracking, calling my name, begging me to wait, to let her explain. I didn't stop. Explanations were for people who deserved second chances. She'd used hers the moment she kissed Derek in that wine bar and thought no one would ever know. Outside the venue, the late morning sun felt surreal, too bright and cheerful for what had just happened. Sophie and I stood by my car, neither of us speaking for a long moment, the adrenaline that had carried me through the ceremony starting to ebb, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She broke the silence first, her voice hoarse. "Did we just do that?" I nodded, unable to find words that matched the magnitude of what we'd pulled off. She laughed, a single shocked burst, then covered her mouth like the sound had escaped without permission. "I thought I was going to pass out when you said you objected. I thought she was going to tackle you right there." I almost smiled, the absurdity of it hitting me in waves. We'd just blown up a wedding, in front of 100 people, with evidence so airtight that no one could dispute it. It felt like something out of a movie, except the knot in my stomach and the tremor in my hands were proof it was devastatingly real. My phone buzzed, a text from my father. "Proud of you, son. Come by the house when you're ready. We'll be here." I showed it to Sophie, and she wiped her eyes. "Your parents are good people." I agreed, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you think she'll try to spin this? Make herself the victim?" Sophie considered, then shook her head slowly. "She can try. But everyone saw the evidence. Everyone heard the audio. And I'll back you up to anyone who asks. She doesn't get to rewrite this." We sat on the curb outside the parking lot, still in our formal clothes, looking like the world's saddest wedding party, and processed what had just happened. Sophie asked if I felt relief, vindication, anything resembling closure. I told her the truth. I felt hollow, like I'd just finished a project that had consumed months of my life and now didn't know what to do with the space it left behind. The anger that had fueled the planning was gone, replaced by a quiet emptiness that felt worse because it meant the hard part was over and the lonely part was beginning. Sophie rested her head on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that didn't ask for anything in return. For what it's worth, you handled that with more grace than most people would have. You didn't yell. You didn't humiliate her beyond what the truth required. You just made sure no one could pretend it didn't happen. I thanked her, meant it, and realized that in the wreckage of my relationship with Rebecca, I'd gained something unexpected. A friend who'd proven that integrity mattered more than loyalty to a lie. We sat there until the venue coordinator came out, looking frazzled, and asked if we needed anything. I told her we were leaving, apologized for the chaos, and slipped her an envelope with a tip I'd prepared in advance because none of this was her fault. The drive back to the apartment felt surreal, the tuxedo constraining, the silence in the car louder than any argument. I'd planned for the confrontation, rehearsed the words, anticipated her deflections, but I hadn't planned for the aftermath. The part where I'd walk into a home we'd built together and start dismantling it piece by piece. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Rebecca's car already there, and my stomach dropped. I'd assumed she'd go to her parents', hide out, regroup before facing me. But she was here, which meant this wasn't over yet. I texted Sophie a quick update, told her I'd call if I needed backup, and walked upstairs with the same measured calm I'd used at the venue. If she wanted a fight, I'd give her facts. If she wanted to apologize, I'd accept it and still leave. There was no version of this where we ended up together, and I needed her to understand that. She was sitting on the couch when I walked in, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face, a glass of wine in her hand that looked like it wasn't her first. She looked up when I entered, and the anger I expected to see was replaced by something more fragile, a kind of broken desperation that made her look younger and smaller than she was. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before I could even close the door. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I made a horrible mistake, and I know I can't take it back, but please don't throw away 3 years over this." I set my keys on the counter, loosened my tie, and chose my words carefully. This isn't about throwing anything away. You already did that the first time you slept with him. I'm just acknowledging what you refused to. She stood, unsteady, the dress making her movements awkward. I never slept with him. I swear, it was emotional, not physical. We just talked, he made me feel seen, and I got carried away. But I never crossed that line. The lie was so transparent it almost made me laugh, but I kept my face neutral. "Rebecca, I have location data showing your phone at his apartment overnight. I have hotel charges. I have audio of you planning a future with him. Stop lying. It's over." Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, the wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the glass. "What do you want me to say? That I'm a terrible person? Fine, I'm a terrible person. But I love you, Marcus. I do. And I thought I could have both, that I could figure it out, and no one would get hurt." I sat in the chair across from her, maintained distance, kept my voice level. "You thought you could have both because you didn't respect me enough to think I'd find out. That's not love. That's convenience. And I refuse to be convenient." She tried a different tactic, leaning forward, her voice taking on a pleading edge. "We can go to counseling. We can work through this. People survive infidelity all the time. We're stronger than this." I shook my head, not angry, just tired. People survive infidelity when both parties want to rebuild trust. You don't want to rebuild it. You want me to forget it happened so you can keep your options open. And I won't do that. She set the glass down hard enough that it cracked against the table, wine spilling across the surface, and her voice rose, frustration bleeding into desperation. "So that's it? You humiliate me in front of everyone I know, and now you're just going to walk away?" I met her eyes, let the question hang, then answered with the simplicity it deserved. "Yes." The finality of it seemed to break something in her, and she dissolved into sobs, the kind that shake your whole body, messy and raw. Part of me, the part that had loved her for 3 years, wanted to comfort her, to soften the blow, to make this easier. But the louder part, the part that had spent weeks documenting her lies, knew that comfort now would only prolong the pain. I stood, walked to the bedroom, and started packing the essentials. Clothes, toiletries, documents I'd already separated into a folder labeled important. She followed me, standing in the doorway, watching me move through the room like a ghost haunting her own life. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice small. I told her I'd stay with my parents for a few days, then find a place of my own. The lease was in both our names, but I'd already spoken to the landlord, arranged to be removed, left her with the option to stay or break it herself. She didn't need to know I'd also documented every joint expense, separated my contributions, and ensured I wouldn't be liable for anything moving forward. Victoria had been thorough, and so had I. Rebecca tried once more, her hand reaching for my arm as I zipped the duffel bag. "I never wanted to hurt you. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but it's true." I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then at her face, and saw someone I didn't recognize anymore. Maybe I never had. "Intent doesn't erase impact," I said, gently removing her hand. "You made choices that hurt me deeply, and the fact that you didn't want it doesn't change the result." I slung the bag over my shoulder, took one last look at the apartment that had been ours, and walked to the door. She didn't try to stop me again, just stood in the middle of the living room in her ruined wedding dress, looking like the embodiment of consequences she hadn't seen coming. I paused at the threshold, not to offer comfort but to make sure she understood. "I hope you figure out what you actually want, Rebecca. But you won't figure it out with me." I closed the door behind me, heard the lock click into place, and felt the weight I'd been carrying for weeks finally start to lift. My parents' house smelled like coffee and the pot roast my mother made when life required comfort food. She hugged me at the door, didn't ask questions, just held on longer than usual and told me my old room was ready. My father shook my hand, a gesture of respect between men who understood that sometimes the right thing and the easy thing were miles apart. We sat around the kitchen table, the three of us, and I recounted the ceremony in detail, the objection, the evidence, Sophie's role, Rebecca's deflection, the walk down the aisle that felt like crossing a finish line I hadn't known I was running toward. My mother cried quietly, not for Rebecca but for me, for the future I'd believed in and the way it had been stolen. My father listened without interrupting, his expression moving from shock to approval to something that looked like pride. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the thing I needed to hear. "You protected yourself. That's not petty. That's smart." My mother added, her voice thick, "And you did it without becoming cruel. That matters, Marcus. That matters more than you know." I spent the next 3 days in a haze of practical tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. I opened a new bank account, transferred my funds, closed the joint account we'd used for wedding expenses. I contacted vendors, explained the situation in clinical terms, and accepted that most deposits were non-refundable but ensured my name wasn't attached to any remaining balances. I changed passwords, updated addresses, separated every digital connection we'd built over 3 years. It felt like reverse engineering a life, dismantling it bolt by bolt until all that remained were two separate people who'd once believed they were building something permanent. Sophie checked in daily, sent memes that were inappropriate enough to make me laugh, offered to help with anything I needed. She'd become my closest ally in a situation that could have isolated me, and I didn't take that for granted. We met for lunch midweek, and she updated me on the fallout. Rebecca had deactivated her social media, stopped answering calls from mutual friends, apparently holed up at her parents' house refusing to talk about what happened. Derek, according to Sophie's sleuthing, had also gone dark, his LinkedIn updated to say he was taking personal time. The narrative in our social circle was unanimous. I'd been wronged, handled it with composure, and no one blamed me for the public exposure. Sophie asked how I was really doing, beneath the logistics and the tasks. I told her the truth. I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the lies were gone, the performance was over, and I didn't have to pretend anymore. heavier because grief doesn't wait for permission, and losing the future I'd imagined hurt even when I knew it was based on fiction. She nodded, understood without needing elaboration, and told me something I'd carry forward. You're allowed to mourn what you thought you had, even if it wasn't real. That loss is still real to you. I thanked her, meant it, and realized that healing wasn't going to be linear or quick. It was going to be messy, full of setbacks and moments where I questioned whether public confrontation had been worth the cost. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the alternative. A marriage to someone who saw me as a financial safety net while she explored emotional connections elsewhere. A life spent wondering when the next lie would surface. A version of myself I wouldn't respect in the mirror. The wedding might have been a spectacle, but the alternative was a slow death by 1,000 hidden betrayals. 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, I signed a lease on a small apartment across town, a 1-bedroom with decent light and space for a home office. It wasn't much, but it was mine, untainted by memories of Rebecca or the life we'd planned. I spent a weekend moving in, assembling furniture, hanging pictures, building a space that reflected who I was without the compromise of shared taste. My parents helped, my father drilling shelves into the wall with the same precision he'd taught me as a kid, my mother arranging kitchen supplies and stocking the fridge like I was heading off to college again. Sophie showed up with a housewarming gift, a framed print that said "New Beginnings" in minimalist script, cheesy but sincere, and I hung it in the entryway where I'd see it every time I came home. That night, alone in my new place, I sat on the couch with a beer and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The engagement that ended in public humiliation. The trust that shattered in a wine bar I'd never been to. The ally I'd gained in the wreckage. The future I'd saved myself from. It wasn't the story I'd wanted to tell, but it was honest, and honesty had become the measure by which I evaluated everything. Rebecca tried to reach out once, a long email that arrived late one night, full of apologies and justifications and requests for closure. She wanted to meet, to talk things through, to explain her side in a way that wasn't filtered through the lens of a public confrontation. I read it twice, considered responding, then archived it without reply. There was nothing she could say that would change the facts, and reopening the conversation would only give her another chance to rewrite the narrative in her favor. Some doors, once closed, need to stay that way. Sophie told me later that Rebecca had reached out to her too, asking if there was any way to repair their friendship, to explain that she'd been under stress and made bad decisions but still valued their history. Sophie's response had been swift and clear. She couldn't be friends with someone who'd lie so extensively and then expect forgiveness without accountability. The friendship was over, not because of me, but because Rebecca had shown her who she really was, and Sophie believed her. The months that followed were quieter, more intentional. I threw myself into work, earned a promotion I'd been chasing, took on projects that challenged me and kept my mind engaged. I started running in the mornings, a habit I'd let slide during the wedding planning chaos, and found that the rhythm of it helped process emotions I didn't have words for. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, accepted invitations I would have declined when I was coupled, built a social life that didn't revolve around someone else's schedule or preferences. Sophie remained a constant, our friendship deepening in the way bonds do when they're forged in crisis. We grabbed dinner weekly, texted random observations, supported each other through the minor dramas that fill adult life. She started dating someone new, a kind man who made her laugh, and I was genuinely happy for her, grateful that good things could still happen to people who deserve them. She asked once if I was ready to date again, if I'd considered putting myself out there. I told her honestly that I wasn't ready, that I needed to rebuild trust in my own judgment before I could trust someone else. She understood, didn't push, and we moved on to easier topics. A year after the wedding, I ran into Rebecca at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of coincidence that feels engineered by the universe to test your resolve. She looked different, thinner, her hair shorter, the brightness I remembered dimmed to something more muted. We made awkward eye contact, and for a second I thought she might pretend not to see me, but she approached, tentative, her voice soft. "Hi, Marcus." I greeted her civilly, kept my tone neutral, and she asked if we could talk for a minute. I agreed, more out of curiosity than any desire for reconciliation, and we sat at a corner table away from the crowd. She started with an apology, more genuine than the one she'd offered in the apartment, less defensive, more aware of the scope of what she'd done. She said she'd been in therapy, working through why she'd sabotaged something good, and that she understood now how deeply she'd hurt me. I listened, didn't interrupt, and when she finished, I thanked her for the apology but made it clear that it didn't change anything. The past was the past, and we'd both moved on. She asked if I'd found someone new, if I was happy, and I told her I was working on it, that happiness looked different now but wasn't out of reach. She nodded, said she hoped I found what I was looking for, and we parted with a handshake that felt like closing a chapter I'd already finished reading. Walking out of that coffee shop, I realized something important. I didn't hate Rebecca. I didn't even think about her most days. The anger that had driven me to gather evidence and plan the confrontation had evaporated, replaced by indifference, which turned out to be the truest form of closure. She was a person I used to know, someone who'd made choices I couldn't forgive, and that was okay. Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, and moving on didn't require pretending it hadn't hurt. I'd built a life without her, a good life, one that didn't include the anxiety of wondering when the next lie would surface. That was enough. Sophie texted that evening, asking how the run-in had gone. I told her it was fine, uneventful, proof that time and distance really do soften the edges of even the sharpest betrayals. She sent back a thumbs up and a reminder that we had dinner plans Friday. Normal life, boring and predictable and infinitely preferable to the chaos of a year ago. The wedding that never happened became a story I told occasionally, when the context called for it, when someone asked about my relationship history or how I learned to trust my instincts. I didn't embellish or dramatize, just laid out the facts, the discovery, the evidence, the confrontation, the aftermath. People's reactions varied. Some thought it was brilliant, a strategic dismantling of a liar who deserved public accountability. Others thought it was harsh, that private confrontation would have been kinder. I didn't argue with either perspective. I'd made the choice that felt right at the time, and I stood by it. The truth had been messy in public, but it had also been undeniable, and that mattered to me more than whether people thought I'd handled it gracefully. What I learned from the whole experience was this: betrayal teaches you things about yourself you can't learn any other way. It shows you how much you're willing to tolerate, how you respond under pressure, whether you collapse or calculate. I'd maintain my dignity, and ensure that the narrative reflected reality rather than the story someone else wanted to tell. Years later, settled into a life I'd rebuilt from scratch, I looked back on that ceremony with something approaching gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the clarity. Rebecca had shown me what I wouldn't accept, and in doing so, had freed me to find something better. The wedding that ended before it started wasn't a failure. It was a course correction, brutal but necessary, and I'd survived it. More than survived, I'd come out stronger, more discerning, more committed to honesty in all its uncomfortable forms. Sophie remained one of my closest friends, a reminder that integrity attracts integrity, and that sometimes the best relationships are the ones forged in fire. We still laughed about the absurdity of it, the maid of honor who knew the truth, the groom who objected to his own wedding, the evidence displayed on a screen for 100 shocked witnesses. It sounded like fiction, but it had been real, and it had changed both of us in ways we couldn't have anticipated. The apartment I'd moved into became a home. The promotion turned into a career trajectory I was proud of. The running habit evolved into marathons and a community of people who didn't know my history and didn't need to. I dated eventually, cautiously, with boundaries I hadn't known I needed before. I met someone who valued honesty as much as I did, who understood that trust was built slowly and maintained carefully, who never gave me reason to doubt or question or gather evidence. We took our time, no rushing toward milestones, no pressure to perform a version of love that looked good on social media. It was quieter, steadier, the kind of relationship that doesn't make for dramatic stories but makes for a peaceful life. And when I thought about marriage again, years down the line, it wasn't with fear or cynicism. It was with the knowledge that I'd walked away from the wrong thing and created space for the right one. The objection I'd made that day wasn't just to Rebecca. It was to a future built on lies. And that objection had saved me. 5 years after standing at that altar and saying 2 words that changed everything, I found myself in a different garden, under different circumstances, with different people. The venue was smaller this time, more intimate, just close family and a handful of friends who'd earned their place through years of genuine connection. Sophie stood beside me as my best woman, a role that made perfect sense to everyone who knew our story. She'd been there through the worst of it and had stuck around for the rebuilding. That kind of loyalty doesn't get a secondary position. The woman walking down the aisle toward me was named Elena, a structural engineer I'd met at a professional conference 2 years prior. We'd bonded over a shared obsession with load-bearing walls and the kind of dry humor that comes from working in fields where precision matters. She knew my history, not because I'd hidden it but because I'd learned that honesty up front saves pain down the road. When I told her about Rebecca and the wedding that imploded, she'd listened carefully and said something I'd never forgotten. She told me that anyone who'd walk away from a lie that publicly was someone worth knowing. We'd taken things slowly, deliberately, building trust the way you build a foundation, checking every level twice before adding the next layer. Standing there watching Elena approach, I felt none of the anxiety that had plagued me years ago. No wondering if she was hiding something. No checking her phone when she wasn't looking. No late-night spirals about whether this was real or another performance. She was steady, transparent, the kind of person who said difficult things directly because she respected me enough to handle the truth. Our relationship wasn't perfect, we disagreed about plenty, but we disagreed openly, worked through it, and came out stronger. That was the difference. Conflict didn't terrify me anymore because I'd learned it didn't have to mean betrayal. The ceremony itself was simple. No elaborate productions, no screens or surprises, just 2 people making promises they actually intended to keep. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, there was a beat of silence followed by Sophie's quiet laugh, a private joke between us that the rest of the guests didn't need to understand. Elena squeezed my hands, her eyes bright with amusement because she knew the story and found humor in the symmetry. We said our vows, kissed to genuine applause, and walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, a phrase that didn't carry the weight of dread it once had. At the reception, my father gave a toast that acknowledged the journey without dwelling on the past. He talked about resilience, about the importance of knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about being proud of a son who'd chosen integrity over convenience. Sophie's toast was lighter, funnier, full of inside jokes about late-night phone calls and strategic planning sessions that sounded cryptic to anyone who didn't know the context. She ended by saying that watching me find real happiness had been one of the greatest privileges of her life, and I believed her because Sophie didn't waste words on things she didn't mean. Later in the evening, as Elena and I danced to a song we'd chosen together, she asked me if I ever thought about that day 5 years ago, if it still haunted me or shaped how I saw marriage. I told her the truth. It didn't haunt me, but it had definitely shaped me. I was more cautious now, more aware of red flags, more insistent on communication even when it was uncomfortable. But I was also more appreciative of what we had, more grateful for a partner who showed up consistently, who didn't make me play detective or question my sanity. The objection I'd raised years ago had closed one door permanently, but it had opened others I wouldn't have found otherwise. She nodded against my shoulder, said she was grateful too, and we kept dancing. I saw Rebecca one more time after that, randomly, at a charity event Elena and I attended for her firm. She was there with someone new, a man who looked pleasant enough, and when our eyes met across the room there was a moment of recognition followed by mutual decision to keep moving. No drama, no awkward small talk, just 2 people who'd once been everything to each other and were now nothing, and that was fine. I didn't wish her harm. I didn't wish her anything. She was a chapter I'd closed with intention, and I had no desire to reopen it even for nostalgia's sake. Sophie pulled me aside during the reception, her own date chatting with Elena near the bar, and said something I'd carry with me long after the night ended. She told me that standing beside me at 2 weddings, one that ended in truth and one that began with it, had taught her more about friendship than anything else in her life. She said that choosing integrity over loyalty to a lie had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but watching me build a life worth living had made it worthwhile. I hugged her, grateful beyond words for someone who'd risked a friendship to tell the truth when it mattered most. The honeymoon was quiet, 2 weeks in a coastal town where we hiked, read books on the beach, and talked about the future without fear or hesitation. Elena asked me once if I ever regretted how I'd handled things with Rebecca, if the public confrontation had been worth the fallout. I thought about it carefully before answering. The truth was, I didn't regret it. Could I have done it differently? Probably. Would it have been as effective? I doubted it. The public nature of the reveal had ensured that the story couldn't be rewritten, that the facts stayed facts, and that I walked away with my dignity intact. That mattered to me then, and it still mattered now. Years continued to pass, ordinary and unremarkable in the best possible way. Elena and I bought a house, argued about paint colors and landscaping, compromised like adults who actually liked each other. We had kids eventually, 2 daughters who learned early that honesty wasn't optional in our home, that trust was something you built through consistent action, not grand gestures. I told them the story when they were old enough to understand it, not to villainize their mother or anyone else, but to teach them that walking away from the wrong thing, even when it's hard, is sometimes the bravest choice you can make. Sophie remained part of our lives, a fixture at birthdays and holidays, an honorary aunt to our girls who adored her. She married eventually, a ceremony where I returned the favor and stood beside her, grateful for the chance to witness her joy after she'd witnessed my pain. The symmetry felt right, a reminder that good people find good things when they refuse to settle for less. Looking back on that moment in the garden, the objection that stopped a wedding and started a reckoning, I understood something fundamental about truth. It's not always kind. It's not always easy. But it's always necessary. The men who taught me to measure twice and cut once had been teaching me about more than carpentry. They'd been teaching me about life, about the importance of precision, about the value of getting it right even when getting it right means tearing it down and starting over. I'd torn down a future that looked perfect from the outside but was rotting from within, and in doing so, I'd built something real. The wedding that never happened became a story my daughters asked about sometimes, curious about how their dad had ended up with their mom instead of someone else. I told them simply that sometimes life gives you clarity in unexpected ways, and the smartest thing you can do is accept it and move forward. They'd nod, satisfied, and return to whatever childhood concern had occupied them before. I'd watch them play, watch Elena garden or read or simply exist in our shared space, and feel the specific contentment that comes from knowing you made the right call when it counted most. The final lesson from that day, the one that took years to fully understand, was this. Objecting to your own wedding isn't an ending. It's a beginning. A refusal to accept the unacceptable. A line drawn in the sand that says some things matter more than keeping the peace. I'd drawn that line in front of 100 witnesses, and while it had been terrifying and messy in public beyond anything I'd imagined, it had also been the moment I chose myself over a comfortable lie. That choice had led me here, to a life I didn't have to investigate or question or protect myself from. A life that was honest, steady, and worth every difficult decision that had come before it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.